December 1944. A transport truck rumbled through the frozen Italian countryside, carrying 23 Japanese-American women who had been captured while serving with the Office of Strategic Services behind enemy lines. They had been trained to expect the worst: torture, starvation, execution. But when they arrived at the remote Allied detention facility in the Apennine Mountains, what happened next would shatter everything they thought they knew about war. These women had prepared themselves for death. Instead, they were offered tea and cookies. Before we reveal why their captors showed mercy when they could have shown cruelty, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 3 weeks earlier in northern Italy, where American forces had captured a group of Axis intelligence operatives during a nighttime raid on a communications outpost. Among the prisoners were 23 women ranging in age from 19 to 34, all of Japanese descent, all with American accents. The Allied commander, Colonel William Bradford, stared at the women in complete confusion. These weren't enemy combatants in any traditional sense. They were American citizens, daughters of Japanese immigrants, who had been recruited by a shadowy Axis collaboration network. They had believed they were serving the land of their ancestors. Now they stood shivering in a muddy compound, waiting for their punishment to begin. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of the few Asian American officers in the U.S. military, was assigned to process the prisoners. She later recalled the moment she first saw them. The women stood with their backs straight, their faces masks of resignation. They expected us to treat them the way Japanese forces treated captured women, with brutality and contempt. You could see it in their eyes. They were already preparing themselves for the worst. The youngest prisoner, 19-year-old Michiko Tanaka from Los Angeles, clutched a small photograph of her parents. She had joined the Axis network after her family was sent to an internment camp in 1942, believing that America had betrayed them first. Now she wondered if her decision would cost her everything. What happened on that first night would set the tone for everything that followed. Instead of being thrown into cold cells with bare floors, the women were led to a converted monastery that served as the detention facility. The rooms had beds, real beds with mattresses and blankets. Private John O'Malley, a guard from Boston whose own grandparents had fled Irish persecution, was assigned to the night watch. He noticed Michiko shivering in the corner of the common room, her thin jacket insufficient against the mountain cold. Without asking permission, he brought her an extra wool blanket and a cup of hot cocoa he'd made from his personal rations. Michiko stared at the cocoa as if it might be poisoned. She looked up at O'Malley with tears in her eyes. "Why?" she whispered in perfect English. "You should hate me." O'Malley's response was simple. "My sister is your age. She's serving as a nurse in France right now. I can't help her stay warm, but maybe I can help you." That single act of unexpected kindness rippled through the compound like an earthquake. The women had been trained to resist torture, to maintain silence in the face of cruelty. No one had prepared them for compassion. The next morning, Lieutenant Chen sat down with each prisoner individually. But these weren't interrogations in any traditional sense. She didn't use harsh lights or intimidation tactics. Instead, she asked them questions that seemed impossibly personal. Where are you from? What did your parents do? Why did you make the choices you made? Keiko Yamamoto, a 28-year-old former teacher from Sacramento, broke down during her session. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "They took everything from us. Our homes, our businesses, our dignity. We were Americans and they locked us up like criminals for having Japanese faces. When the network approached me, told me I could serve my true homeland, I thought finally someone valued me for who I was." Lieutenant Chen listened without judgment. Then she did something that shocked Keiko to her core. She apologized. "What the U.S. government did to Japanese Americans was wrong," Chen said quietly. "I can't change that. I can't give back what was taken from you. But I can tell you this, treating you with cruelty won't make anything right. Two wrongs don't make justice." These conversations continued for days. Each woman expected to be broken down, to have her secrets extracted through pain. Instead, they were being given something far more unsettling, the opportunity to be heard. 5 days into their detention, Something unprecedented happened during dinner service. The women were being fed the same rations as the Allied soldiers, not luxurious, but adequate. Hot soup, bread, occasional meat. But on this particular evening, Private O'Malley noticed that Michiko wasn't eating. He approached her table cautiously. "Everything okay?" She looked up at him with embarrassment. "It's Friday," she whispered. "My parents, we always observed meatless Fridays, even in the camp. It was our way of honoring my mother's Catholic faith alongside my father's Buddhist traditions." O'Malley stood there for a moment, processing this information. Then he walked to the kitchen and returned 15 minutes later with a plate of scrambled eggs and vegetables. "Would this work?" he asked. Michiko's hands trembled as she accepted the plate. Other women at nearby tables had witnessed the exchange. For the first time since their capture, several of them began to cry openly. These weren't tears of fear or pain. They were tears of cognitive dissonance, the complete shattering of everything they thought they understood about their captors. Yuki Nakamura, a 32-year-old who had worked as a code analyst, later wrote in her diary, "How do you maintain hatred for people who remember that you practice meatless Fridays? How do you see them as monsters when they treat you with more dignity than your own handlers ever did?" Colonel Bradford made a decision that his superiors would later question. He opened the facility's small library to the prisoners. Not censored propaganda, but actual books, novels, poetry, history. The women devoured them with a hunger that surprised the guards. Michiko discovered Steinbeck and Hemingway, reading about an America she had once called home. Keiko found works by Eleanor Roosevelt about social justice and human dignity. Each book became a small rebellion against the narratives they had been fed by their Axis handlers. Lieutenant Chen began hosting informal discussion groups in the library. What started as intelligence gathering sessions evolved into something resembling a college seminar. They discussed democracy, citizenship, identity, and belonging. The guards who volunteered to monitor these sessions found themselves drawn into the conversations, unable to maintain the emotional distance that military protocol demanded. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, whose family had immigrated from Mexico, shared her own struggles with being seen as other in America. "My father fought in World War I, she told the group, came back with medals and still couldn't eat in certain restaurants. But you know what he told me? He said the America he fought for wasn't the America that existed yet. It was the America that could exist if enough people fought to make it real." These weren't the words of an interrogator breaking down enemy agents. These were the words of someone who understood the painful complexity of American identity, the gap between the nation's ideals and its realities. 6 weeks into their detention, news reached the compound that would change everything. The Office of War Information had declassified photographs and testimonies about the treatment of prisoners in Japanese military camps. The images were horrific, stories of systematic brutality, starvation, and torture. Lieutenant Chen gathered the women in the common room and made a decision that violated every intelligence protocol. She showed them the evidence, not to shame them, but to illustrate the choice she and her fellow soldiers were making every single day. "This is what we could do to you," she said quietly, gesturing to the photographs. "This is what some people think we should do to you. An eye for an eye, cruelty for cruelty." She paused, letting the weight of those images sink in. "But here's what I need you to understand. We're not choosing to treat you with dignity because you deserve it. We're doing it because of who we choose to be. Because the moment we start justifying cruelty, we become the thing we're fighting against." The room was absolutely silent. Several women were staring at the photographs with expressions of horror and shame. They had known, on some level, what the Japanese military was capable of. But seeing the evidence of systematic brutality, knowing that their own handlers had been part of that system, forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the choices they had made. Michiko spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were told that American camps were concentration camps, that Japanese Americans were being tortured and killed. We believed we were fighting against oppression. Some of what you were told was true," Lieutenant Chen acknowledged. "The internment camps were unjust. Japanese Americans were treated terribly. But look around this room. Look at how we're treating you. even knowing what you did. Ask yourself, which story about America is true? The one about the internment camps or the one about the blankets and hot cocoa and meatless Fridays? Keiko raised her hand slowly, as if she were back in one of her Sacramento classrooms. What if they're both true? What if America is capable of both great injustice and great mercy? Lieutenant Chen smiled sadly. Then maybe the question isn't what America is. Maybe the question is what America is becoming, and whether you want to be part of making it better. In February 1945, orders arrived from Washington regarding the prisoners' status. They would be transferred to a facility in California for formal legal proceedings. Given their status as American citizens who had collaborated with enemy forces, they faced potential charges of treason. Colonel Bradford called a meeting to inform the women of their transfer. He expected relief. California was warmer, closer to their families, a step toward resolution of their uncertain status. Instead, he was met with anxious faces and unexpected questions. Michiko stood up, speaking for the group. "Colonel, may we ask what will happen to us in California?" "You'll receive legal representation," Bradford explained. "Due process. Fair trials." "Will we be together?" Yuki asked. "Will we be treated the way we've been treated here?" The question hung in the air with all its implications. These women, who had arrived expecting torture and death, were now worried about losing the humane treatment they had received from their captors. They had found something in this mountain detention facility that they feared losing, not just physical comfort but a sense of dignity and the possibility of redemption. Private O'Malley, listening from his post near the door, felt his throat tighten. 3 months ago, these had been enemy agents. Now they were people he cared about, people whose futures mattered to him. As the date of transfer approached, something unexpected began happening. The women started writing letters, not to lawyers or family members, but to the soldiers who had guarded them. Michiko's letter to Private O'Malley would later be preserved in the National Archives. It read, "Dear Private O'Malley, I don't know if you'll ever understand what that first cup of cocoa meant to me. I had spent weeks preparing myself for death. I had convinced myself that I didn't matter, that I was just a casualty of a war bigger than any individual. Then you gave me a blanket and asked if I was warm enough. You saw me as a person when I had forgotten how to see myself that way. Whatever happens to me in California, I want you to know that you saved my life. Not by keeping me from dying, anyone could have done that. You saved my life by reminding me that I was worth saving." Lieutenant Chen received dozens of similar letters. Each one was a testament to the power of small acts of humanity to transform enemies into something else, not quite friends, but no longer adversaries. People whose stories had become intertwined in ways that war was never supposed to allow. The legal proceedings in California were complex and emotionally charged, but something unusual happened during the trials. Instead of maintaining their silence or mounting aggressive defenses, the women testified openly about their experiences. They talked about the injustice of the internment camps that had driven them to collaborate with enemy forces. But they also talked about the Italian detention facility, where they had been shown a different vision of what America could be. Keiko's testimony was particularly powerful. She said, "I was taught that America would never see me as truly American because of my face, my heritage. Then I was captured by American soldiers who treated me with more respect than my own handlers ever had. They didn't erase the injustice of the internment camps. They didn't make everything okay. But they showed me that America is not just one thing. It's a constant struggle between its worst impulses and its best ideals. And I realized that I wanted to be part of that struggle, not fighting against it." The prosecuting attorneys had expected to face hostile enemy agents. Instead, they encountered women who had undergone genuine transformation. The defense attorneys argued for leniency, citing the extraordinary circumstances of their radicalization and the evidence of their sincere remorse. In the end, the sentences were unprecedented. Rather than long prison terms or execution for treason, the women were given suspended sentences contingent on their participation in a public education program about the dangers of radicalization and the importance of maintaining American values even in the face of injustice. 20 years later, in 1965, the women who had been detained in that Italian monastery organized a reunion. They invited the soldiers who had guarded them, the ones who had shown them blankets and hot meals and unexpected mercy when they expected nothing but cruelty. Private O'Malley, now a middle-aged businessman with children of his own, attended the gathering. He found Michiko, now Michiko Chen, married to Lieutenant Chen's cousin and working as a social worker helping refugee families adjust to life in America. "Did you ever regret it?" she asked him over coffee. "Treating us with kindness when you could have been harder on us?" O'Malley thought for a moment. "I used to wonder if I was too soft, if I should have been more suspicious. But then I see what you've done with your life, what all of you have done. You didn't just survive, you became proof that people can change when they're given the chance. How could I regret that?" The reunion made local news, and the story of the detention facility began to spread. Historians started to study it as an unusual case of how humane treatment of enemy combatants could lead to genuine rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Colonel Bradford, retired and teaching military ethics at West Point, used the case in his lectures about the moral complexities of warfare. "We're trained to see the enemy as other, as less than human," he would tell his students. "But the moment you recognize the humanity in your enemy, everything changes. Not because it makes you weak, but because it makes you responsible for how you exercise your power." Lieutenant Chen, who eventually rose to the rank of Major General, often spoke about the Italian detention facility as a turning point in her understanding of what military service meant. "We won the war with weapons and strategy," she said in interviews. "But we could have lost the peace by treating our enemies with the same cruelty they showed us. Those women taught me that true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about choosing mercy when you have the power to choose otherwise." The women themselves became advocates for various causes. Michiko worked with refugee resettlement programs, helping newly arrived immigrants navigate the same complex questions of identity and belonging that she had struggled with. Keiko became a teacher again, but this time focusing on civics education and the importance of critical thinking about government actions. Yuki wrote a memoir about her experience that became required reading in several university programs about conflict resolution and reconciliation. In it, she described the cognitive dissonance of being shown humanity by people she had been trained to see as enemies. She wrote, "I expected torture and received tea. I expected hatred and received curiosity. I expected to be treated as the enemy, and instead I was treated as a person who had made terrible choices but could still choose differently." That difference between punishment and rehabilitation, between revenge and redemption, that's the difference between a society that perpetuates cycles of violence and one that has the courage to break them. Today, historians still debate the unusual case of the Italian detention facility. Some argue that the women received preferential treatment because of their American citizenship, and that similar mercy should have been extended to all prisoners of war regardless of nationality. Others point to it as evidence that humane treatment of enemies can serve strategic purposes by winning hearts and minds. But perhaps the most important legacy of that small monastery in the Apennine Mountains is the question it poses to each generation. What do we do when we have the power to inflict cruelty, but choose mercy instead? How do we balance justice with compassion? And how do we ensure that our treatment of enemies reflects the values we claim to be fighting for? The women who expected torture but received blankets and hot meals became living proof that people are capable of change when they're treated as human beings rather than as monsters. They arrived at that detention facility as enemy agents. They left as Americans in the truest sense, people who had seen both the best and worst of their country and chosen to dedicate their lives to strengthening the former and opposing the latter. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human conflict, individual acts of decency can plant seeds of transformation that grow into something larger than anyone imagined. That a cup of hot cocoa offered on a cold night can become the first step toward redemption. That recognition of shared humanity can be more powerful than any weapon in breaking cycles of hatred and revenge. As Michiko said at that 1965 reunion, holding up a faded photograph of herself at 19, shivering in that compound on her first night, I was prepared to die for what I thought was right. But someone gave me a blanket instead, and in doing so, gave me the chance to live for something better. That's not weakness. That's not naivete. That's the kind of strength that actually changes the world.